So we're going to start actually sculpting out our character's overall structural and muscular anatomy, which of course means we need to know some terms, we need to know some breakdowns, we need to know some of the general shapes. So let's start by talking about those shapes. In our understanding of shapes, there's basically three major shapes that characters can be thought of as being combined of. Squares, circles, triangles. Of course, we think about cubes, spheres, and cones. But, the square kind of shape tends to be rigid, sturdy, immovable. So something like the depiction of Kingpin in Into the Spider-Verse is very stubborn. Not only is he a literal physical obstacle, he's shaped like a wall, but we demonstrate the character is incredibly stubborn and can't see the error of his own ways. At the same time, Carl Fredricksen, the creators and designers of this character for Up, literally started by drawing squares on a sheet because they said we wanted a character that was set in his ways and demonstrated an inflexibility, a rigidity. And slowly through the movie, in fact, his features soften, and little things like the little round pin that he gets from Russell is a circular object, literally bringing a little circle or softer shape to his overall form as his shape transforms throughout the movie. And then I think about like the robots, for instance, from Titanfall are big and very blocky in their design on purpose because relative to the rest of the battlefield in that game, the robots are a safe haven. You can go into the mechs and it protects you and you're pretty much indestructible when you're inside them. And so we have big, blocky, it's indestructible, it's immovable, and it's very safe. Then we move down to the round characters. Round is soft, it's friendly, things with round edges can't cut or poke you or harm you in any way. They tend to be, like you said, soft and fairly smooth. So Kirby or Hello Kitty are both very round characters, but even someone like Homer Simpson is largely made up of round shapes as opposed to pointier shapes because we want to demonstrate that the character, even though he does a lot of terrible things, he's generally pretty harmless is the way we're supposed to understand that character. And the round shapes help us understand that we're not supposed to take the things he does that seriously. Then you get into triangles. Triangles are like horns or spikes or spears or shark's teeth. These are things that are sharp, they're pokey, they're dangerous. They're also very fast. So if you take Kirby and you give him a bunch of triangles, you get Meta Knight. At the same time, whereas Homer from The Simpsons is literally just circular shapes, we see the villainous sideshow Bob that they gave this dreadlocks haircut so that would literally have triangles pointing out. He's often depicted like this instead of a gun with a dagger because it's more triangles. His nose is a triangle. A lot of his features shape into triangles, and his feet are actually large, long, elongated triangles, as pokey as they can make him. And so his gestures, his movements are stabby, literally, because it's a very threatening shape. And then if you think about somebody like Sauron, that is a character as a villain that is literally just covered in knives. It's just shape after blade after blade after blade because that's what triangles say. One of the shapes that's really important to us in character design is what we call the taper. And it's this golden shape that's really important because a lot of the human form is these round blobby masses, but they can be made up of and thought up of as several tapers stacked together. And this taper is based on the golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence of 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, like 3, 5, and 2, 3 plus 5 is 8, and so forth and so on, forms this rectangle that gives us this golden ratio. We can also think about it as a 30-70 portion here to here. And we like this because unlike a purely neutral, like if the apex of the curve was right in the middle, there'd be no directionality to it. The taper points in a direction, and that really helps with character design. We want things to point down the chain, to have intention, to have a direction to them. So these are a bunch of characters, and look at all of the tapers that are really on them and how important the tapers and then the places the shapes join in together. So, we got like a large sort of taper here, and we can see the smaller legs and bigger upper body create this exaggerated hero shape. Someone like Tracer, we see long, skinny, tapering up legs because it makes her look very fast, and we really spend a lot of real estate, quite the opposite here to Captain Quark. Tracer's sort of visual weight is all at the top, and so it exaggerates the length of these legs. In fact, that's also the reason the gradient here works so well. It helps fade and draw the legs out more. The legs themselves, as you notice, have like that apex. for the upper and the lower leg. I'm going back here. And so like if you look at specific spots all over the form, you'll see little tapers everywhere because again, that taper is always more interesting. I think about like Baymax from Big Hero 6 and the story between Baymax and his sort of soft and hard modes is an inverted taper. We go from this and the shape is actually flipped upside down to provide more drama. But again, more tapers everywhere on this shape. Here, the tapers tend to be down and low, and here the tapers tend to be high and moving down, which creates more drama versus this is like softer and friendlier. And then even something like Master Chief. Tons of tapers, even if it's relatively neutral and the character is more realistic, there's always a direction to the shape, to the way it should push. Doom is a really good example of Doom Guy, is just covered in every shape where they can. They have put some pushed out tapering line because it makes the visual design much more interesting. If that taper shape has the inflated part at the center, it's much, much less interesting. Another way we can create visual interest is by comparing and contrasting curved versus straight lines. This is actually something that does happen on the human body. We have places where there's a curve as opposed to a straight. For instance, the front of your upper leg curves out, whereas the back kind of curves in, something I'll show a little bit. And we often push those further. So we're starting with something like this with our sculpt, very neutral and very firm, but we want to create tapers and flat contrasts, and then a tapering form, and then like a flat part of this leg. So this is a good example of Bruce Timm, who is the animator behind all the DC animated work, did the excellent Batman the Animated Series, and Bruce Timm's work involves a lot of contrast between curve and straight, curves and straight, because it helps create contrast and draws the eye towards the simple side. And so this is something that's used a lot in like core character design to say like, how can we take the simplest, fewest number of lines, but give them the most visual interest possible? And it's something we're trying to recreate in 3D. I'm going to skip over faces because I'm going to leave the faces for when I talk about facial anatomy next week. When we talk about the head, though, as an overall structure, one of the ways we can break that down is to think of it like an egg and a couple of cylinders. One cylinder being the neck and the other cylinder being the relative face and jaw. Because from a top-down view, the head isn't a complete round sphere. In fact, it actually, again, tapers back a little bit, where it's at its thickest back here and up here. And it's narrower in the front than it is the back. So it sort of slopes out this way and it has this overall oval-like curved shape, but from the front, the face is relatively flat, and then the chin wraps under, where you can see there's sort of a cylindrical shape to the chin. And of course, the neck itself is a cylinder intersecting those two. It's one of the ways we can think about it. Again, these are some excerpts from the really excellent book, which if you like character, highly recommend you get it, Anatomy for Sculptors, where they really show this idea. The head is not round or oval shaped, it instead tapers inward. And understanding that widest point is right about here is really important. Just over the top of the center of the ear itself, and lined right up with the temples, right up at the side, just above the eyes. It's really an essential part of getting that shape correct. Moving down the body, the neck, as I mentioned before, doesn't connect straight in. It connects with the body at an angle. This is really important because there's actually a ton of muscles on our back that sort of reach up into our necks, and that's what makes this angle fall down like this, because we need a cavity right here to be able to move our arms, and we need a thick part back here to be able to have enough mass to like put all the muscles in. There's a couple major neck groups, so a couple major muscle groups. One of the most important are the sternocleidomastoids. I can't pronounce that, but we have basically the trapezius, which is these muscles in the back, which reach up back here. So that's these on this female model here. We can see the trapezius, and it's almost described to me almost like a cape that reaches over the shoulders and comes all the way back down. So reaches from the neck and into the shoulder. And then these sternocleidomastoids, I think is how you pronounce it, which go right from under the ear and down right here to just the top of the clavicle and the sternum, which allows us to turn our necks. And they're one of the most major muscle groups down here. Moving further down, we get into the torso. Now, the torso is an overall bean shaped, is how I like to think about it. It's usually that's like the best way to describe it. And we can think about it in terms of like overall cross sections. So as we cross sectionally go down the body, we see up at the top, it has this wider oval. And as we get further and further down, it kind of gets more rounded out as we get into the core torso. And that's the same for male and female anatomy. It's that, again, in tending, female anatomy, we tend to see wider hips. Male anatomy, we tend to see wider shoulders. Again, body types vary all over the place. We tend to think of those as the averages of different body types. The rib cage is this upper section here, and it's completely rigid. It's what holds our lungs and our organs, and it lets us stretch a bunch of muscles over top of the rib cage, but when we move and flex, it doesn't collapse our lungs or crush our heart or something like that, because the rib cage protects it. Almost all of the movement happening in your upper body is in this little section of the torso, which is where your abdominals are. Something to think about with these muscle groups is the actual biceps, the pectoral muscles they connect back here and they stretch out over, and they actually work with the deltoids and stretch into this form. So it comes up and over into the shoulder. We'll talk about the arms in a second, but it's important to understand too that what we think about as like the 8-pack or what have you is just a series of several different muscle groups, the bottom of which in most people is actually one single muscle. Some people have a genetic predisposition to turn that bottom into 2, which is where you get that like 8-looking pack of muscle tissue on like really extreme bodybuilders. But again, only if you have that predisposition. On almost everybody else, it's one solid movement. We get the bottom mass is right about where the belly button is, the next one over the top of it, and then on top of that, just under the rib cage. Also note that there's quite a lot of space between the pectoral muscles and the start of our abdominals. We have this little sort of stretch. I guess this is technically a little bit more abdominal in here, but we usually don't read it that way. We usually read it as this 6 kind of pack. I said 8. I keep saying 8. I meant 6. Because this is I think sometimes you think about it as an abdominal muscle, but it usually doesn't show up that way. But this is sort of the ridge that's on top of the rib cage or right under the pectoral. So these are, and then there's a series of abdominal muscles called the obliques that stretch around the body itself. So these are some of the crucial masses, but for most of your characters, if you think about it relatively as a bean shape with these muscles stretching over the top, these muscles running up and down, and these muscles running around the sides, you're going to be mostly fine. When we get into the arms, the best way of thinking about the arm and the arm muscles is like a chain. We have a couple major arm muscles here. We have the deltoid, the bicep, and then right behind it on the back is the tricep. And then we get into this really tight wired grouping of forearm muscles. Our forearms have lots of little interconnected muscles because these muscles are used to articulate the fingers. You can see like my arms moving here. That's what those muscles do. And in general, every muscle moves the next thing higher up in the chain. So the bicep is what actually lets this arm flex this way. The tricep has to do with this pushing movement outward. And then the deltoid is sort of what's helping us rotate all of this kind of stuff up here, as well as the back muscles like the trapezius. So everything is moving something further down the chain. But we can also think about it like a chain with the deltoid wrapping over, and then our bicep and tricep sort of facing the opposite way in the link, and then our forearm and then our hand, each sort of linking together in this kind of a loop. And the question is, with your hand, it doesn't actually rotate on the wrist. Like if I was a robot, I might have a little ball joint here, and my hand would just be able to rotate 180 degrees. But instead, I have 2 bones here, my radius and my ulna, which if I twist them in my arm actually lets me do the rotation of my hand. So it works all the way across, as opposed to my humerus up here, which does not. This is one solid bone here, and then these are 2 paired together, allowing me to twist and rotate my wrist. And these have different alignments depending how it's twisted. When we're modeling characters, we try to keep this as neutral as possible. We don't want to twist or rotate them because it's going to make modeling it harder, because you'll be activating a lot of muscles. We try to keep things as muscularly neutral as possible. Going down into the legs are very similar, where we have, similarly to we have a femur instead of the humerus, like one large, and the tibia and the fibula instead of the radius and the ulna, which are the 2 joints on there. I might have 1 or 2 of these names switched up. I've been a really long time since I took an artistic anatomy. But But what they do, the legs, what's important to understand is that they connect at an angle. So this angle is really important. That's sort of defined by the iliac crest, but it's also the way our skin and everything sort of bends as we pull it up together. The knee is about halfway between the top and bottom bones, and the leg, something to remember is it connects up a lot higher than people think. There's also sort of people describe it as a rhythm to the shape. Something I mentioned before is there's like a flat and a curved, and then there's a curved and a flat. So there's sort of an opposite happening here, but it's really thinking about these big shapes like this curve and then this flat, and then this curve, and sort of like this is like flat and this is curved and that part's flat. There's like interesting contrast happening. We want to think about this as some of the large masses. We have one large muscle that kind of connects from up here right under the iliac crest, which is that area. Again, if I mentioned in the last video, if you sort of feel right where your waistband sits, you'll feel like a bony mass on your side. That's the iliac crest, which is the top of your hip bones. And this muscle connects from here and wraps down and over top of the leg and sort of sits on top of the knee. And then for the actual lower leg, the front of it is a lot of bone. You can probably feel the bone on your shin. It has sort of a trapezoidal quality to it. But we have in the very back here our calf muscles, which are two groups of muscles, but usually present themselves as one that are sort of joined up together in one big mass. We have another muscle coming through the backside. We have this muscle group on the inside of our thigh. I have like I said, I'll talk about the end. I have a little reference sheet for you to check out with a lot of these. Moving on to hands and fingers. Again, hands and feet together, about half the bones in your body. But the fingers need a couple things. So for one thing, the fingers naturally fan out. They should be able to stretch. And the human hand should be able to curl into a fist. It's something, in fact, other primates can't do. If you look at primates, they don't actually punch. They slap or hit with their palms because their fingers are longer and they can't curl them into a club-like fist like we can, which many biologists think was a really early tool for humans. And so the spacing between these is really important. There's sort of a 2, 3, 4 parts kind of a thing going on here, where just like when we built the fingers out and we spaced things out by how much went into there. The hand itself is made up of 3 major pads, the one right here under our thumb, this pad on the opposite side of our thumb, and this other pad right below our fingers. It's important to think about that the fingers aren't straight aligned. In fact, the alignment is something at an angle like this because, again, it presents the opportunity to curl. And again, don't forget there needs to be little gaps in between the fingers, otherwise they can't bend and flex. So these are just a couple rough landmarks I want you to really be thinking about. Kind of thinking through it too. Something to really consider, I mentioned before, that iliac crest right here, which is this part of the rib cage, is really important to understand where the legs actually start or connect from. One of the things I put up on for everybody on our little channel, let me open up Discord, that's going to be useful for all y'all in our course materials section. I added this anatomy reference board. My anatomy reference board is a fairly large, let me load it up. So it's a pretty large, I think it's like almost 700 megabytes, but it's just tons and tons of images that you can use as reference. I have some full body sort of tips and tricks guides, but you can see here they're broken down by section. So when you're starting out with just like proportions, these are some nice guides for that. If you're thinking about blockouts, here's some good reference for overall musculature that you might be thinking about. But when you get to things, say like you're working on, you might be getting to a spot where you're working on the arm. You can go to the arm section, and here's a section on just basic proportions. Here's some anatomical reference of muscles, and then it gets down to smaller groups like shoulders and hands. You don't have to go into this level of detail. This is a little kit I put together for some of the advanced character modelers. But you might find some references. It's whenever I'm doing character work, I always have my separate board of just anatomy when I'm doing the block out, because it really helps me figure out, even if I'm doing a very stylized character, what it is I'm trying to exaggerate. Because they're going to take shortcuts in 2D that I have to figure out how to recreate in 3D well enough with 3-dimensional form. So having a good reference map of what I'm trying to recreate is really essential. So always good to have that up. All right, I'll see you in the next one.